I knew something was wrong the moment my son-in-law reached for the microphone. The ballroom at the Hartford Country Club glittered under crystal chandeliers, waiters drifting between round tables with trays of champagne, everyone dressed in tailored suits and silk dresses, celebrating Daniel Carter's promotion to regional director, a title he had chased for years. And as I sat there in my navy blue suit, the one I bought at Macy's last spring, I felt proud, truly proud, because I remembered the nights my daughter Emily cried at my kitchen table worrying whether they would ever get ahead, and I remembered the $250,000 wire transfer I made quietly from the life insurance policy my late husband left me, money meant to carry me through retirement, money I decided family needed more. Daniel tapped his glass and laughed, thanking his colleagues, praising his team, calling Emily his rock, and the room responded with warm applause. Then he smiled in my direction, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "And of course, my mother-in-law came tonight because she never misses a chance at free champagne." The room erupted in polite laughter, the kind that rolls quickly and dies just as fast, and for a split second every face turned toward me. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I did not lower my head. I did not frown. I did not give them the satisfaction of looking wounded. I lifted my glass slightly, as if to toast his joke, and took a slow sip. The champagne tasted dry and expensive, and I thought about the budget spreadsheets I once helped him reorganize at my dining room table when creditors were calling and his credit score had dropped below 600. 5 years ago, there was no ballroom, no promotion, no applause. There was only panic, overdue notices stacked 3 inches high on their kitchen counter, and Daniel sitting across from me admitting he might lose everything. I had told him then, family stands together. I meant it. That night, as the laughter faded and Daniel continued his speech, I studied him carefully. Confidence changes a person. Success can make gratitude disappear as quietly as steam off a cup of coffee. Around me, colleagues nodded approvingly, unaware of the history that made this celebration possible. Emily avoided my eyes, busy adjusting the cuff of her husband's jacket, and I understood something in that moment. Respect, once surrendered, rarely returns on its own. I stayed until dessert was served, mini cheesecakes no bigger than 2 inches across, then placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and slipped out before the dancing began. No one stopped me. The March air outside was crisp, about 40 degrees, and it cleared my thoughts better than any conversation could have. By the time I reached my car, I wasn't angry. I was certain. Some lessons don't require raised voices. Some corrections don't happen in ballrooms. And as I started the engine and watched the lights of the country club fade in my rearview mirror, I knew that the same steady hands that once saved his future were more than capable of reshaping it. When I arrived home that night, I did not turn on the television, and I did not pour myself a drink. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, the same oak counter where I once spread out bank statements and utility bills to help Daniel understand the difference between revenue and cash flow, and I allowed the silence of the house to settle around me. Widowhood teaches you how to sit with quiet. It also teaches you how to think clearly when emotions try to cloud your judgment. I removed my blazer carefully and hung it over the back of a chair, then walked down the hallway to my small home office. The file cabinet stood exactly where it always had, second drawer from the top labeled financial documents. I pulled it open and slid out a manila folder thick with papers dated 5 years earlier. Inside was a promissory note, signed in blue ink by Daniel Carter, outlining a loan of $250,000 with a structured repayment schedule that had been paused, not forgiven. The terms were simple and fair, interest set below market rate, payments deferred for 24 months to give them breathing room. I had told him at the time that paperwork protects relationships. He had agreed, grateful and humbled. I sat at my desk and reread every page slowly, not because I doubted what was written, but because I wanted to feel the steadiness of facts. Facts do not laugh at you in crowded rooms. Facts do not make jokes at your expense. Facts remain exactly as they are. The following morning, I rose at 6:30 as usual, brewed a pot of coffee, and watched the early news while the sky lightened over my backyard. At 8:15, I called my attorney, a woman I have trusted for over a decade, and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. I did not dramatize the situation. I simply explained that I wished to resume the repayment terms of an outstanding private loan. By 2 o'clock, I was seated across from her polished mahogany desk, The promissory note laid neatly between us. She reviewed the document and nodded. Everything was enforceable. Everything was clear. There would be no raised voices, no family arguments in driveways, no scenes. There would be a certified letter outlining the resumption of payments and a 60-day deadline to begin installments. Professional, direct, lawful. As I drove home, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt alignment. For years I had told myself that patience was the same as kindness, that silence was the same as grace. But there is a difference between generosity and invisibility. That night at the country club, Daniel had mistaken my generosity for weakness. He had confused my quiet presence with dependency. He believed I was an accessory to his celebration, not a cornerstone of his survival. What he did not understand was that I have never needed applause to know my worth. And I have never required a microphone to correct a misunderstanding. The certified letter was mailed on a Tuesday morning at 9:42, and I remember the exact time because I looked at the receipt before folding it into my purse. There is something grounding about certified mail. It does not argue. It does not accuse. It simply confirms delivery. For the rest of that week, I continued my routine as if nothing had shifted. I attended my Thursday book club at the library, trimmed the hedges along my driveway, and met my neighbor for coffee on Saturday morning. Discipline is a form of dignity. I refused to let anticipation turn into anxiety. On Friday afternoon, my phone rang while I was reorganizing a drawer in the kitchen. Emily's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of pettiness, but to steady my voice. She did not begin with a greeting. She began with, "Mom, what is this letter Daniel received?" Her tone carried confusion wrapped tightly around embarrassment. I explained calmly that the repayment terms of the loan had resumed, as originally agreed, and that the first installment would be due in 60 days. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her trying to reconcile two versions of me, the mother who packed her lunches for 12 years and the woman who had just enforced a contract. She said Daniel felt blindsided. I reminded her gently that blindsided implies surprise without warning, and nothing in that document was new. We had all signed it willingly. Emily's voice softened, and beneath the defensiveness I heard something else, something closer to realization. She asked whether this was about the party. I answered honestly. It was not about a joke. It was about clarity. When respect becomes optional in a relationship, boundaries must become permanent. That evening, Daniel called. His tone was measured, but the confidence I had seen in the ballroom was missing. He spoke about cash flow projections, about bonuses not yet paid, about the optics of a repayment schedule so soon after a promotion. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I was pleased with his success, and that successful men honor their commitments. I reminded him that the interest rate remained far below what any bank would offer, and that the repayment plan was structured in manageable monthly amounts. Silence followed. Then he asked if there was room for negotiation. I replied that there was always room for accountability. We agreed to meet the following Sunday for dinner at their home to discuss logistics. After I ended the call, I did not feel triumphant. I felt composed. For years, I had allowed gratitude to fade into assumption. Now, the balance was being restored. Not through shouting, not through public correction, but through paper, ink, and a steady hand. Sunday arrived with a pale gray sky and a thin layer of frost still clinging to the edges of their front lawn when I pulled into the driveway at 4:55 in the afternoon. I noticed the new luxury sedan parked beside Daniel's SUV, a recent purchase that spoke quietly of confidence and upward movement. I rang the doorbell at exactly 5 o'clock, carrying a small apple pie I had baked that morning, not as a peace offering, but as a reminder to myself that I would not let tension redefine who I am. Emily opened the door, her smile careful and slightly strained, and she hugged me longer than usual. The house smelled of rosemary chicken and lemon polish. Daniel greeted me in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, voice steady but lacking its usual edge. We sat at the dining table where I once helped them draft a monthly budget on a yellow legal pad, and for a moment the familiarity of the setting almost softened the purpose of my visit. Dinner conversation stayed polite, centered on work schedules and an upcoming corporate retreat in Chicago. Only after the plates were cleared and coffee was poured did Daniel place the folded copy of the promissory note on the table between us. He cleared his throat and began outlining his proposal, suggesting a reduced monthly payment for the first year while his bonus structure stabilized. His tone was professional, almost rehearsed, as if this were a boardroom negotiation rather than a family conversation. I listened carefully, hands resting calmly around my coffee cup. When he finished, I acknowledged his plan and asked one question. If the roles were reversed, would he advise a client to delay repayment on a legally binding obligation simply because public perception might be uncomfortable? He hesitated, then admitted he would not. I nodded and explained that the repayment schedule was not punishment. It was restoration. I told him that success carries responsibility, and responsibility begins with honoring those who stood beside you before the applause. Emily's eyes filled, not with anger, but with recognition. She said quietly that she had not realized how that night at the celebration had affected me. I told her it was never about embarrassment. It was about understanding value. Respect is demonstrated in small moments long before it is tested in large ones. Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The confidence that once masked his gratitude seemed to dissolve, replaced by something more honest. He agreed to the original repayment terms and asked whether there was anything else I needed. I looked at both of them and said that what I needed could not be written into a contract, but it could be practiced daily. When I left their house that evening, the frost had melted from the grass, and the air felt clearer. The road home was quiet, and, for the first time since the ballroom laughter, I sensed the balance shifting back into place, not because I had demanded it loudly, but because I had required it calmly. The first payment arrived exactly 30 days later, transferred electronically at 8:17 in the morning, and I noticed it because I checked my accounts with the same discipline I once used to check homework assignments when I was a librarian. The amount matched the agreed schedule down to the dollar. No rounding, no hesitation. I did not call to acknowledge it immediately. Accountability does not require applause. It requires consistency. Over the next several weeks, something subtle began to change. Emily started calling on Wednesday evenings again, not out of obligation, but to ask about my garden or the mystery novel I was reading. Daniel sent a brief but polite message confirming each upcoming installment before it was due. There was a shift in tone, a carefulness that had been absent before. Respect often returns quietly, the way spring replaces winter without announcement. About 6 weeks after our dinner conversation, Emily invited me to attend a small corporate recognition luncheon where Daniel would be presenting quarterly results. I paused before answering, not because I feared another joke, but because I understood that presence is powerful. I agreed to attend. The event was held in a modest conference center rather than a ballroom, with simple linen tablecloths and pitchers of iced tea instead of champagne. When Daniel stepped up to speak, his posture was confident but grounded. Midway through his remarks, he acknowledged the mentors and supporters who had shaped his journey. Then he looked directly at me and said, "And I want to thank Margaret, who taught me that integrity is worth more than any title." There was no laughter this time, only sincere applause. I did not smile broadly or wave. I simply inclined my head slightly, accepting the recognition the same way I had accepted the repayment schedule, calmly and without theatrics. After the luncheon, Daniel approached me privately and said he had been reflecting on what leadership truly means. He admitted that success had made him careless with his words, and that he had confused humor with humility. I told him that growth often begins with discomfort, and that I was glad he had chosen to grow. The remaining payments continued on schedule, each one a reminder that agreements honored strengthen relationships rather than weaken them. More importantly, conversations at family dinners felt balanced again. I was no longer the silent background figure at the table. I was included in discussions about travel plans, investments, and future goals. The dynamic had recalibrated, not because I demanded reverence, but because I demonstrated boundaries. Looking back, I realized that the real correction had never been about money. The money was simply the language he understood best at the time. The true lesson was about value, about remembering who stood steady when circumstances were uncertain. And as I sat on my porch one evening watching the sun lower behind the maple trees in my backyard, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. I felt peace, knowing that dignity, once reclaimed, does not need to be defended again. By the time the third payment cleared, nearly 3 months had passed since the evening at the country club, and the rhythm of accountability had settled into something steady and predictable. Each transfer arrived on the first business day of the month, never late, never short, And with each confirmation email, I felt less like a creditor and more like what I had always been, a woman who understood that structure protects relationships better than silence ever could. Autumn had begun to lean into winter, and the maple leaves in my backyard had turned a deep amber before finally surrendering to the cold. One Saturday afternoon, Emily stopped by unannounced, her cheeks pink from the wind, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and admitted that the past few months had forced her to examine her own behavior. She said she had laughed that night because everyone else had laughed, and that she realized now how easily comfort with a crowd can override loyalty to family. I listened without interrupting, because growth deserves space. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, not dramatically, just firmly, and said she was proud of how I handled everything. I told her that pride was not the goal. Stability was. When Daniel arrived later that evening to pick her up, he stepped inside rather than waiting in the driveway, as he often had in the past. He asked about my retirement plans, about whether I had considered traveling more now that the loan repayments were underway. The question was different from the casual small talk we once exchanged. It carried consideration. I explained that I was reviewing my long-term investments and thinking about a spring trip to Charleston, somewhere warm with history and quiet streets. He nodded thoughtfully and said that if I ever needed help reviewing financial projections, he would be glad to assist. It was a subtle offering, but I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to contribute rather than to take. Over the following weeks, family dinners regained a sense of balance. Conversation flowed without sharp edges. When humor surfaced, it was self-aware rather than dismissive. I noticed that Daniel listened more carefully before speaking, and when he did speak, he chose his words with intention. Respect had not been restored through confrontation. It had been rebuilt through consistency. As winter settled in and the first light snowfall dusted the rooftops of our neighborhood, I reflected on how easily roles can become distorted when gratitude fades. It takes very little for someone to assume that steady support will always be there regardless of how it is treated. But support, like any investment, requires acknowledgement. I did not need repayment to feel powerful. I needed recognition of value. And now, as the months continued forward with calm predictability, I understood that the most meaningful corrections are rarely loud. They are measured, deliberate, and strong enough to realign an entire family without breaking it apart. By early spring, the repayments had become so routine that I no longer checked my account with anticipation, only with the quiet habit of a woman who believes in order. 5 installments had been completed, each one arriving precisely on schedule, and with them came something more valuable than the numbers themselves. There was a noticeable shift in how I was regarded within my own family. Invitations were no longer last-minute courtesy gestures. I was consulted about plans before decisions were finalized. When Emily and Daniel began discussing the possibility of purchasing a larger home closer to the shoreline, they asked for my perspective before meeting with their real estate agent. It was a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes. One Sunday afternoon, they invited me to walk through an open house with them, a colonial-style property with white shutters and a wide front porch. As we moved from room to room, Daniel asked thoughtful questions about long-term maintenance costs, property taxes, and neighborhood stability. At one point he paused in the kitchen, sunlight pouring through the windows, and said he had learned more about financial discipline in the past few months than in all his years climbing the corporate ladder. I did not respond with praise. I responded with truth. I told him that titles may open doors, but character determines how long they remain open. Later that week, Emily came over for dinner, and as we prepared salmon and roasted vegetables side by side, she admitted that she once assumed I would always be there regardless of how I was treated. She said familiarity had made her careless. I appreciated her honesty because accountability shared is stronger than accountability imposed. As the final payment date approached, Daniel called to confirm that he intended to complete the remaining balance in one lump sum using his annual bonus. The tone of his voice carried pride, not resistance. When the transfer cleared, closing the loan entirely, he sent a brief message that read, "Thank you for believing in us when we did not yet believe in ourselves." I read the words twice, not because I doubted them, but because I understood their weight. That evening, they invited me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown. Nothing extravagant, just a warm table by the window and sincere conversation. There was no grand speech, no dramatic apology. Instead, there was steadiness. Daniel raised his glass and said he was grateful for second chances and for lessons delivered with grace. I met his eyes and saw humility where there had once been assumption. As I drove home beneath a sky streaked with pale pink and gold, I realized that the greatest correction had not been financial at all. It had been relational. Boundaries had not fractured our family. They had strengthened it. And in the quiet hum of my car as I turned onto my street, I felt certain that dignity, once demonstrated, becomes a standard others learn to meet. As summer approached, the rhythm of our family life felt lighter, almost effortless, as though a quiet weight had been lifted from the room without anyone announcing it. The loan was fully repaid, the paperwork neatly filed away in the same cabinet where it had once waited as silent leverage, and what remained was not tension but understanding. Emily and Daniel closed on the colonial house near the shoreline in late May, and on moving day I arrived early with a box of labeled storage bins and a cooler filled with sandwiches and iced tea. No one assigned me a corner or treated me like a guest. Daniel handed me a set of keys without hesitation and asked if I would supervise the delivery of the dining table while they met with the contractor about minor repairs. Trust, I realized, had replaced assumption. As I stood in their new kitchen directing the movers where to place each chair, I remembered the first time I sat at their old kitchen table reviewing unpaid bills and wondering whether they would recover from their financial missteps. The contrast was not dramatic. It was steady. Later that afternoon, when the last box was carried inside and the truck pulled away, Daniel gathered us on the wide front porch. The ocean breeze carried a hint of salt, and sunlight reflected off the neighboring rooftops. He thanked everyone for their help, then turned to me and said that this house represented more than a promotion or a bonus. He said it represented a lesson in responsibility that began long before his career accelerated. His words were simple, without performance, and that simplicity mattered. I told him that homes, like families, require maintenance, and that respect must be reinforced the same way foundations are reinforced, consistently and without neglect. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small gestures that confirmed the change was lasting. Emily called to ask my opinion about paint colors rather than deciding alone. Daniel forwarded me an article about retirement investment strategies and asked what I thought. When neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves, he introduced me not merely as his mother-in-law, but as someone who had shaped his understanding of accountability. There was no grand ceremony marking this shift. It was woven into ordinary days, into shared meals and casual conversations. One evening, as we sat together on their porch watching the sun sink below the horizon, Daniel admitted that he once believed confidence meant never needing help. Now he understood that strength includes honoring those who provide it. I looked out at the quiet street, at the steady line of houses standing firm against the coastal wind, and I felt something deeper than satisfaction. I felt continuity. The correction that began months ago had not divided us. It had matured us, and in that calm, golden light, I understood that dignity, once asserted with clarity, becomes a legacy others learn to carry forward. Nearly a year after that evening in the ballroom, we gathered again for a celebration, this time in the backyard of Emily and Daniel's new home, strings of warm lights hanging above the porch and a long wooden table set, with simple white plates and fresh flowers from the local market. It was Daniel's 40th birthday, and the air carried that soft coastal breeze that makes summer evenings stretch a little longer. I arrived with a homemade strawberry shortcake, the same recipe my husband loved, and as I stepped through the gate, I noticed something different immediately. Daniel walked toward me before greeting anyone else, took the cake from my hands, and thanked me for coming. Not as a formality, as intention. Throughout the evening, neighbors and colleagues drifted in and out of conversation, and more than once I heard Daniel introduce me with quiet pride, explaining that I had been instrumental in teaching him the importance of honoring commitments. There was no exaggeration in his tone, no attempt to impress, only acknowledgement. After dinner, someone suggested a few words to mark the occasion. When Daniel stood, there was no microphone, no spotlight, just the gentle hum of conversation settling into silence. He spoke about growth, about second chances, and about the humbling experience of realizing that success without gratitude is incomplete. Then he looked at me and said that the most valuable investment he had ever received was not financial, but personal accountability. The guests applauded softly, and this time when eyes turned toward me, I did not feel heat rise to my cheeks. I felt steady. I raised my glass, not in defense, not in forced grace, but in shared understanding. Later, as the evening wound down and the last of the guests said their goodbyes, Emily wrapped her arm around mine and rested her head briefly on my shoulder. She said she hoped that one day she would handle challenges with the same calm strength. I told her that strength is not something you are born with. It is something you choose, especially when choosing silence would be easier. Driving home under a sky scattered with stars, I reflected on how close we had come to allowing a careless moment to define our family dynamic. It would have been simple to withdraw completely, to let pride build walls. Instead, I chose clarity over confrontation, structure over resentment. The loan is long repaid now, the paperwork filed away as a closed chapter, but the lesson remains active in our daily interactions. Respect is no longer assumed. It is practiced. And as I turned into my driveway and switched off the engine, I understood something with certainty. The true victory was never about correcting a joke or reclaiming money. It was about reminding everyone at that table, including myself, that dignity does not demand attention. It commands alignment.